You guys back, quick review of week 5 this time. Week 5 we covered topics related to the biosphere. And essentially what we got into right away were some of the cycles, the geocycles that weren't covered in any of the other lectures, and provide many of the important chemicals required for life on Earth, so be it plants or human beings, and those specifically were the carbon and the nitrogen cycles. We got into life, talked about that a bit, talked about what's essential for life to be able to develop, and some characteristics of life, and then how we classify life into different into species, into populations, and further on into ecosystems altogether. When we talked about ecosystems, we went into sort of the main areas that represent an ecosystem, or the main players, and those are the producers, your primary producers, which we talked would be grasses and plant life. We talked about your primary consumers, so those are typically what we call herbivores, or things that eat only plants. We talked about secondary consumers, things that eat the plants, and things that eat the plants as well. And then overall we talked about carnivores and humans being at the top, and some of the problems that causes as well. Remember back to some of the ideas of biomagnification, and how if something is poisoned at the ground level, even the plants, that pollution or poison then transfers up to trophic levels and further on. So have a review of that. And we talked about the biomass pyramid. So essentially this is an idea in biology or biogeography that shows in an area what the level of producer, primary consumer, and tertiary, secondary, and tertiary consumers are, and how that pyramid essentially supports life in providing the level above it with enough food to be able to consume. We also talked about moving up those levels, that only about 10% of the energy gets transferred on to the next level, or the next organism that eats that level. We talked about the biomes, and this is where we broke into groups, and we talked, and you did the research on what are the characteristics that make certain biomes. So I hope everybody was participating, and if you didn't get a chance to write any of those notes down, they're easily found, some descriptions and characteristics of those biomes all over the internet. So, but mainly what that had to do, and it followed up with a beautiful chart that showed the combination of temperature and precipitation, and how both of those, so your hydrosphere and your atmosphere, really play a role in the biodiversity all across the world, and how areas with low precipitation and high temperature have certain plant characteristics or life form characteristics than other places. So then we went into soil. One of the areas that I thought is probably the most overlooked but most important feature of life on Earth as it is. And we talked about the components, we talked about the cycle of soil development, and there was a chart that showed you the progress through, and also a nutrient cycle, a forest nutrient cycle that really captures what happens when organic matter falls to the ground. It's decomposed by bacteria into food for the plants again. So an interesting concept and a good chart to know. And then we talked about plant succession. And there was a graph that showed plants as they work their way up and succeed themselves up into an entire big growth forest. And that has some important concepts relating to the last idea about soil and soil samples, or soil cycles as well. And really that was it. There was a couple other interesting points on how important plants are, and there was some videos to check out about the disappearing bee colonies, and there was some ideas that we saw in the video about Monsanto and about our food systems and our food sources. So quite an interesting idea about plants in general. And that was week 5, the biosphere.